She was doing everything right, or at least everything her doctor had told her to do. Metformin twice a day, never missing a dose. She had swapped white bread for whole grain. She cut out desserts completely, 3 walks a week every week without fail. And yet, when I looked at her chart, her most recent hemoglobin A1C, that's the 3-month average of your blood sugar, was sitting at 8.1%, still deep in the diabetic range, still not where she needed to be. She hadn't come in for her diabetes that day. It was something else entirely, something minor. But when I saw that number in her file, I couldn't ignore it. I asked her gently how she had been managing her blood sugar, and she listed her routine for me with this quiet, worn-out frustration. It was the voice of someone who had been following every instruction, doing exactly what she was told, and getting nowhere. I understood that frustration immediately, because the advice she had been carrying around, the plan she had been loyal to, was not wrong, but it was incomplete. There is an enormous amount of well-researched, physiologically sound information about what actually shifts blood sugar that simply never makes it into a standard 10-minute consultation. And that's not because doctors don't know it exists. It's because 10 minutes doesn't leave room for explaining how things work, for talking about mechanisms. But here's the thing, it's the mechanisms that change behavior. When you understand what's happening inside your body, and why something matters, the choices you make stop feeling like restrictions and start feeling like tools. That is what this video is about. This is not the same conversation you've already had. This is not the standard advice to just cut your carbohydrates. This is about 6 specific practical remedies, each one backed by peer-reviewed research, each one with a real biological explanation that goes deeper than the surface. These are things most people living with diabetes have never been told about. I'm Dr. Meilin. I'm an emergency medicine doctor, and after nearly 10 years working in the A&E, I've seen a pattern across thousands of shifts. What I see over and over again are the downstream consequences of chronic disease that went unmanaged for too long. And diabetes is one of the primary drivers, not because people aren't trying, they are. But so often, they're trying with a picture of their biology that has too many blank spaces. My goal with this channel is to help fill those gaps. Before we go further, one important note. Nothing in this video replaces your prescribed medication or your own doctor's personalized guidance. I am certainly not suggesting that anyone managing type 2 diabetes should abandon their treatment plan. What I am saying is that these remedies, supported by published research, can work alongside your medical management to meaningfully improve your outcomes. Please have a conversation with your doctor before you make any changes. I want to ask you one quick thing. If what you're learning here is giving you a clearer picture of what's actually happening inside your body, please consider subscribing to this channel. It takes 2 seconds. It costs nothing at all, and it makes a real difference to whether this kind of research-based content can actually reach the people who need it most. Alright, let's keep going. The standard framework for managing blood sugar focuses correctly on reducing carbohydrate intake and losing weight. These things matter. They matter a lot, but they are what I would call upstream interventions. They reduce the amount of glucose entering your system in the first place. What they don't really address is what happens to that glucose once it's already there. Why do some people's cells respond beautifully to insulin and others don't? Why can the exact same meal produce a wildly different glucose spike depending on what you ate right before it? Why can sleeping poorly for a single night reduce your insulin sensitivity the next morning by as much as losing 15 pounds of body fat would improve it? When I use the word remedy in this video, I want to be really precise about what I mean. I am not talking about a cure. I am talking about targeted interventions, specific actions that have documented physiological mechanisms, things that change how your body actually handles glucose at the cellular or hormonal level. Some of these work through the gut, some through the muscle, some through the brain, and one of them, and this is genuinely worth staying for, activates a glucose uptake pathway in your muscle cells that operates completely independently of insulin, meaning your insulin resistance cannot block it. The question is never just how much glucose are you taking in. The deeper question is, does your body have the biological machinery to handle it properly? If you stay with me until Remedy 3, I'll explain how a 10-minute walk after a meal can activate a glucose absorption pathway that your insulin resistance cannot reach, and why the timing of that walk matters almost as much as doing it at all. So let's start with the first remedy. This is acetic acid before a meal. Now let me separate the remedy from the folk myth right away. Apple cider vinegar has picked up a lot of wellness claims over the years that have no real evidence behind them. This is not one of those. The active compound here is acetic acid, and its effect on your blood sugar operates through 2 distinct and well-documented mechanisms. The first mechanism is called delayed gastric emptying. When you consume diluted acetic acid before you eat, it slows down the rate at which food leaves your stomach and moves into your small intestine. That transition into the small intestine is where carbohydrates are broken down into glucose and absorbed into your bloodstream. So, If you slow that transfer even modestly, the glucose rise after eating becomes more gradual. That sharp post-meal spike, the kind that causes oxidative stress and over time vascular damage, gets blunted. Research published in the Journal of Functional Foods has shown that this mechanism alone can reduce the glycemic response to a carbohydrate-containing meal by between 20 and 35% under controlled conditions. The second mechanism works through your gut's own hormonal system. Acetic acid appears to stimulate the release of GLP-1, that stands for glucagon-like peptide 1. It's a hormone secreted by specialized cells lining your small intestine. What GLP-1 does is signal your pancreas to release insulin, but it does it in a glucose-dependent fashion. That means it amplifies your insulin response precisely when your blood sugar is rising, and it quiets down when it isn't. You may have heard of GLP-1 in the context of medications like semaglutide, a class of diabetes and weight loss treatments that work by mimicking this exact hormone. Now, acetic acid's effect is far more modest than a pharmaceutical GLP-1 agonist, but the underlying biology, the pathway it taps into, is the same. So what does the practical protocol look like? 1 to 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar, diluted in a full glass of water, consumed about 10 to 15 minutes before your largest meal. Please hear me on this, undiluted vinegar is corrosive to tooth enamel and the esophagus, always diluted, and it works best as part of a broader nutritional approach, not as a standalone fix. It isn't a magic ingredient. Think of it more like a biological signal. Your gut knows exactly how to respond to it. Now, remedy 2. This is the sequence you eat your food in. This is possibly the most underappreciated finding in diabetes nutrition research over the past decade. And what makes it remarkable is that it requires almost no change in what you eat, only a shift in when, within a single meal, you eat each component. Here's what the research shows. When you begin your meal with vegetables and protein and leave the carbohydrate portion, the rice, the bread, the pasta, for last, the blood sugar rise that follows is significantly lower and more gradual than if you eat those same foods in the reverse order. Same meal, same calories, same carbohydrate load, just a different sequence. The mechanism here is deeply practical. Starting with fiber and protein slows gastric emptying, similar to what we discussed with acetic acid. It also primes the release of incretin hormones, molecules that prepare your pancreas to release insulin more effectively. So when the glucose from the carbohydrate portion arrives, your insulin response is already mobilized and ready to meet it. You are not just throwing sugar into a quiet system, you are giving your body the signal to get ready first. For someone living with type 2 diabetes, this is a remarkably gentle intervention. You are not being told to remove the foods your family eats. You are just being asked to arrange them differently on your plate and eat them in a different order. Vegetables first, protein next, carbohydrates last. The effect is measurable, and the science behind it is sound. Now here's where things get really interesting. Remedy 3. This is the post-meal walk and why timing changes everything. Yes, exercise lowers blood sugar. Most people managing diabetes know this. But what most people don't know is why at the molecular level, and why the timing of a short walk after eating is fundamentally different from the same walk taken in the morning before breakfast. Here's what's happening inside your muscle cells. Your muscles absorb glucose through 2 completely separate pathways. The first is the pathway that insulin resistance disrupts. Insulin binds to a receptor on the cell surface that triggers a cascade of signaling inside the cell, and a glucose transporter, something called GLUT4, moves to the cell surface and absorbs glucose. When insulin resistance is present, this signaling cascade is impaired. The receptor is less responsive, GLUT4 moves sluggishly, glucose lingers in the blood, and blood sugar stays elevated. The second pathway is entirely independent of insulin. When your muscle contracts during any kind of physical movement, those same GLUT4 transporters are physically pulled to the cell surface through a completely separate signaling route, one that does not require insulin's involvement at all. This pathway works through something called AMPK, AMP-activated protein kinase, which we will return to in just a moment. But the critical point for you right now is this. In people with type 2 diabetes and significant insulin resistance, the insulin-dependent pathway is compromised, but the contraction-dependent pathway, the one activated by simply moving your muscles, is often still intact. Muscle contraction can bypass the problem entirely. Now consider the timing. Your blood glucose peaks approximately 30 to 45 minutes after you begin eating a meal. A brisk 10-minute walk, started just 10 to 15 minutes after you finish eating, means that your muscles are actively contracting at precisely the moment that glucose is flooding into your bloodstream. That glucose, which would otherwise pool there, is being redirected directly into your working muscle tissue. You are essentially opening a side door. Research published in the journal Diabetology found that 3 10-minute post-meal walks reduce 24-hour average blood glucose more effectively than a single 30-minute morning walk. even though the total exercise duration was identical across both conditions. The biology rewards timing, not just volume. The single best window to move your body is the 15 minutes after you finish eating, and most people do the exact opposite. They sit down, they rest. If you make just one adjustment from this video, let it be this one. Stand up, walk around the block, walk around your home, just move for 10 minutes after your meal, your muscles will do the rest. Now let's move to Remedy 4. This is Berberine activating the body's master metabolic switch. Berberine is a yellow-colored compound found in several plants, including barberry and golden seal. It has been used in traditional Chinese medicine for well over 1,000 years, primarily for infections and inflammation. Western researchers began looking at it seriously for metabolic disease in the early 2000s, and what they found genuinely surprised them. Berberine activates AMPK, the same AMP-activated protein kinase we just discussed in the context of muscle contraction. AMPK functions as the body's cellular energy sensor. When it detects that a cell's energy is running low, or when it is artificially activated by compounds like berberine, it initiates a coordinated metabolic response. It suppresses glucose production in the liver, a process called hepatic gluconeogenesis. It improves the sensitivity of both muscle and liver cells to insulin, and it promotes GLUT for translocation, encouraging direct glucose uptake into muscle cells. Now here's what's remarkable. These are the same three primary mechanisms targeted by metformin, one of the most widely prescribed diabetes medications in the world. Multiple head-to-head clinical trials, including research published in the journal Metabolism, have directly compared berberine to metformin in people with type 2 diabetes. They found comparable reductions in fasting blood glucose and hemoglobin A1c over a 12-week period. But let me be unambiguous here. I am not recommending that anyone replace their metformin with berberine. Metformin has decades of safety data, well-established dosing protocols, and a mountain of robust evidence behind it. Berberine supplements are far less regulated and can vary significantly in quality and bioavailability. What the berberine research illustrates so beautifully is that AMPK activation is a genuinely powerful and specific mechanism for improving glucose metabolism, and in some individuals, it can be supported alongside medical management. If you are considering berberine, the typical research dose is 500 milligrams, 2 to 3 times daily, taken with meals to reduce the gastrointestinal side effects some people experience. This is entirely a conversation to have with your doctor. It is not a decision to make on your own. Remedy 5 is magnesium. This is the deficiency that dismantles insulin signaling. Here is a number I want you to sit with for a moment. Approximately 48% of adults in the United States consume less magnesium than their body requires, according to data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. In people with type 2 diabetes, that proportion is even higher, and here's why that cycle is so cruel. Elevated blood glucose drives excessive magnesium excretion through the kidneys, so the disease itself progressively worsens the very deficiency that makes it harder to manage. The reason this matters so specifically for blood sugar control is the role that magnesium plays inside the insulin receptor. Magnesium is a required cofactor for an enzyme called insulin receptor kinase. A cofactor is not a nice-to-have, it is structurally necessary for the enzyme to function at all, without adequate magnesium. The insulin receptor, even when insulin is present and perfectly bound to it, cannot transmit its signal efficiently into the cell. You can picture it this way: the lock receives the key, but the mechanism inside has seized, it won't turn. Insulin resistance, in a significant proportion of cases, is not just about the receptor's sensitivity. It is also about whether that receptor has the raw materials it needs to do its job in the first place. A meta-analysis published in Diabetes Care, covering 13 separate prospective studies, found that higher dietary magnesium intake was associated with a significantly lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes, and in people who already had insulin resistance, magnesium supplementation was associated with measurable improvements in fasting glucose, fasting insulin, and calculated measures of insulin sensitivity. The best dietary sources are dark leafy greens, pumpkin seeds, legumes, and nuts. If you are considering supplementation, magnesium glycinate and magnesium malate are the most bioavailable forms. They are also the least likely to cause the digestive side effects associated with the more common magnesium oxide. It is also worth asking your doctor for a red blood cell magnesium test, not the standard serum magnesium, which is far less sensitive and routinely misses deficiencies. This is particularly important if you have been managing high blood sugar for a long time. You simply cannot optimize how insulin works if the receptor doing the work is missing a critical component. Remedy 6 is deep sleep. This is the overnight blood sugar reset that most people ignore. This might be the most overlooked of all 6 remedies, partly because it doesn't feel like an intervention, partly because the mechanism connecting sleep to glucose metabolism is not widely known outside of research settings. But from a physiological standpoint, what happens during deep sleep is as influential on your next day insulin sensitivity as almost any dietary change you could make. During slow-wave sleep, that's the deepest stage of non-REM sleep, your brain clears accumulated metabolic waste. Growth hormone is released in its largest daily pulse, and cortisol, a glucocorticoid hormone that directly raises blood glucose, is suppressed to its lowest level of the entire 24-hour cycle. This cortisol suppression is critical for blood sugar regulation. Cortisol stimulates the liver to produce glucose through gluconeogenesis, the same pathway that berberine targets through AMPK. When deep sleep is insufficient or fragmented, that cortisol suppression is incomplete, background cortisol remains elevated. The liver keeps producing glucose even in the absence of food, and the sensitivity of your cells to insulin drops at the same time. A study published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism demonstrated that a single night of poor sleep reduced insulin sensitivity the following day by approximately 25%. That is a metabolic impact comparable to gaining 10 to 15 pounds of body fat, not after weeks of poor sleep after one night. What this tells us is that every night of poor sleep is a metabolic event. It's not just about feeling foggy or tired the next morning. It shifts your entire glucose landscape. There is also what's called the dawn phenomenon. This is a naturally occurring rise in blood glucose that begins between roughly 4 o'clock in the morning, as cortisol starts climbing to prepare your body for waking. In people with healthy insulin function, this morning glucose rise is managed efficiently in people with impaired insulin signaling. It causes morning readings that are elevated before a single calorie has been consumed. Poor sleep amplifies this phenomenon significantly. It raises the cortisol baseline from which that morning climb begins. But here's the surprising part. The practical point here is not simply to sleep more. It is to protect your sleep architecture, specifically the proportion of your sleep spent in deep slow-wave stages. Deep sleep is disproportionately concentrated in the first half of the night. That's why consistent sleep timing, going to bed at the same time each evening, actually helps preserve it. A cool, dark sleeping environment supports the drop in core body temperature that initiates slow-wave sleep, and alcohol in the hours before bed specifically disrupts the transition into deep sleep stages, even when it seems to help with falling asleep initially. These are not minor adjustments. For someone managing their blood sugar, protecting deep sleep is as consequential as anything you would put on your plate. Sleep is not passive recovery. At the hormonal level, it is the overnight environment in which your body either repairs its insulin response or makes it worse. When you look at these 6 remedies together, a coherent picture starts to emerge. They are not a random collection of tips. Each one targets a specific identified failure point in the way your body processes and responds to glucose. Acetic acid addresses the rate at which glucose enters the bloodstream and primes the gut's own insulin-amplifying hormones. Meal sequencing changes the hormonal environment the meal lands in, using the same food to trigger a more prepared physiological response. Post-meal walking activates a glucose uptake pathway in your muscle that insulin resistance simply cannot block. Berberine turns on the same metabolics which that established medications target through a plant-derived compound with a growing evidence base. Magnesium restores the molecular component that allows your insulin receptor to actually do what insulin is asking it to do, and deep sleep protects the overnight hormonal environment upon which your next day insulin sensitivity depends. None of these replaces medical management, but each one is a legitimate, mechanistically understood tool, and the distinction I want to leave you with is this. There is a significant difference between reducing blood sugar by restricting what goes in and improving how efficiently your body handles what it receives. Both matter. But most people are only working on the first half of that equation. These 6 remedies represent the second half. Diabetes is a manageable condition, and it is most effectively managed by people who understand at some level of biological detail what they are actually managing. If this video gave you even one mechanism worth exploring further with your doctor, please give it a like and share it with someone who is navigating this condition. That one small action keeps this channel going, and it might reach someone who has been following instructions for years without understanding the biology behind them. I'm Dr. Meilin. I will see you in the next one.